Shelley said, "Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar." Profound thought and an ability to transcend the physical and the dreary marks Romantic writing, different from any other. It nurtures in the heart of the reader a door to a world full of overflowing knowledge untouched before. I'm indeed certain that this lecture would broaden our perception of reality. On behalf of the Department of English, it is indeed an honor for me to welcome Dr. Gargi Talapatra as a key speaker today. We're delighted to have you amongst us, ma'am.
Thank you.
I extend a hearty welcome to Professor Nishi Pandey, Manager, Awadh Girls Degree College, Dr. U. Chaturvedi, Principal, Awadh Girls Degree College, and all the faculty members and students from various colleges and universities across the city. I now invite our Principal, Dr. U. Chaturvedi, to deliver her opening address and formally begin the program.
A very good afternoon to each and everyone present here. It's a matter of immense pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Gargi Talapatra, Assistant Professor from Bhavanipur Educational Society, Kolkata, and all the faculty and students from across the city. I congratulate the Department for English for organizing a special lecture on Romanticism and employing interesting methods of teaching, learning for students, adapting to a new normal of COVID time. I wish you all a lot of luck and in all your endeavors, lots of best wishes to the Department of English, especially Dr. Ranjana Krishna, Dr. Seema Singh Katyar, and Dr. Deeksha. It's really my pleasure attending this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I now invite Dr. Ranjana Krishna to steer the program forward.
Hello and welcome to Awadh Girls Degree College on this virtual platform. On behalf of the Awadh family, I extend a hearty welcome to dear students and faculty members who have joined us today from various parts of the state. In today's session, we also have colleagues and students joining from the City of Joy, Kolkata. A very warm welcome to you all. In this virtual conference room, I recognize some familiar faces and names. A cordial welcome to all of you. We are extremely happy that the principal, Dr. Chaturvedi, has taken time out from her busy schedule and she has joined us here for this special lecture. Thank you, ma'am, for gracing the occasion. The year 2020 is very special to us, with the 60th batch of the students graduating this year. To mark this milestone, the college embarks on the ambitious program to strengthen the digital resources by starting online special lecture series. This is specially designed to create e-content for the students of literature across the state, covering the topics of the prescribed common syllabus. It is my proud privilege and honor to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Gargi Talapatra. Dr. Talapatra teaches American, British, and Indian literature at Bhavanipur Education Society College, Kolkata. Her areas of specialization are translation studies, subaltern studies, Indian literatures, and cultural studies, a subject close to her heart. And many of her poems are set in this theme. Her poetry collection, titled Pebbles Downstream, was widely acclaimed book. As a recipient of prestigious fellowships, she has conducted research in premium institutes. Dr. Talapatra has served on many committees at Sahitya Academy and is on several editorial books. It is indeed an honor for us to have you here, ma'am, this afternoon. I sincerely hope that you will all enjoy the talk. Looking forward to a very fruitful lecture. I would now invite Amna Khan to deliver formal welcome address and introduce the speaker to the audience. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Honorable Dr. Talapatra, respected Principal Dr. U. Chaturvedi, faculty members of the various colleges, and dear students who have joined us today from the various parts of the city. Came forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. William Wordsworth. Romanticism was an artistic and literary movement that came to England in 18th and 19th century, had a profound impact on the literature. English Romantic literature is characterized by love of nature, destructive reason, and rejection of traditional authority. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Talapatra. She is a professor of English at the Bhawanipur Education Society College, Calcutta. She has taught at several institutions at the undergraduate and postgraduate level for the last 11 years. A gold medalist in English literature from the University of Calcutta. She received a research associateship from the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla in 2016. She also teaches as a guest faculty in the Department of English, University of Calcutta. A critic, creative writer, a translator, she has been published in various academic journals of repute and has 2 books to her credit. Today, she will deliver a talk on the topic Romanticism in English Literature. It's a kind notice to all the audience that the audience will be allowed to ask questions after the talk. You will kindly raise your hand and drop the question in the chat box. The host will unmute you to ask the question. Thank you. Now, I would invite Dr. Talapatra to deliver the talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, Amna. That was a beautiful welcome, a very warm welcome. And first of all, I extend my thanks to Department of English, Awadh Girls Degree College. Good afternoon, Principal Ma'am. Good afternoon, Ranjana, and hello everybody here. I'm here to deliver a lecture today on Romanticism in English literature, an overview to Romanticism as we understand it in English literature. And as Amna has already very beautifully summed up what are the chief characteristics we associate with Romanticism in English literature, without further ado, I would seek your permission to begin with the lecture, and I would begin sharing my screen. I have a brief presentation to deliver, so please allow me to do so.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With firm belief in the network and the internet connections, I proceed with the presentation and the lecture for today, Romanticism in English Literature, an overview. Now, when we talk about Romanticism, when we hear the word Romanticism, and whenever we ask a student, so where do you date Romanticism in English literature? The first thing we get to hear, or the first thing we refer to, is 1798, with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge. However, it is important here to remember that though literary ages change, this change from one literary age to another is not a random or a sudden change. So if we are talking about the beginnings, in general, we use Romanticism as a term in the context of English literature, precisely to refer to literatures written towards the end of the 18th century to sometime in the 1830s. Publication of Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798 is considered to be a marker. Now, my lecture today, when we talk about Romanticism, what I would like to talk about is, or draw your attention to right at the beginning, is we all know literary periods change. But why do these literary periods change? We are all familiar with daffodils through the eyes of Wordsworth. But my question is, daffodils had existed in England all through this time. So why didn't anybody else pick up daffodils and write about it? Why was it Wordsworth who suddenly had to bring it to our notice? So literary ages change, but why do literary ages change? Why do literary periods change? And when we say literary periods change, what I would like to also question here, or like to bring to your notice rather, is that literary periods do not change overnight. If Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, the preparation, the ground had been prepared for the same for quite some time by different writers through that span of the 18th century. And literary periods, when we say they change because of changes in the thinking patterns. Literary periods change because people develop a change in their thinking pattern, because of the changes in the dominant structures, the structures which can be socio-political, cultural, and changes in basically the ideological paradigms. It is all these three which collectively lead to changes in the literary period. Now, the changes in literary periods or ages may be therefore be seen as a transition from the previous period. And any transition is spaced out over a certain duration of time. And my point is, the case is no different for Romanticism. A ground for transition had been laid already. We begin at the beginning today. So, literature, the term, implies, if we are to break it further, content and form. Content, what is written, form, the way it is written. Form and content gradually undergo a change when periods change, when literary periods change. And when form and content undergo a change, this change is slow, this change is gradual, and not always simultaneous. But a symbiotic change in form and content eventually brings about what we call a change in the literary age or literary period. When we are considering Romanticism, the period just before that, which we could be talking about, is what we refer to as the neoclassical age. I am trying to get at it in terms of poetry. So, Romanticism in English literature may be said to have begun by those we refer to as the precursors to Romanticism. The writers who indicated from around the midst of the 18th century that a change was making its way through the dominant thought patterns, and that a change in ideologies had also been initiated already. Hence, when we go back to the neoclassical period and we are looking at that kind of poetry, and if we were in a classroom discussion, perhaps we would have spoken about Pope. And when you see poetry by Pope, you see it's very different. It deals with absolutely different subject matter considered when you compare it to the Romantic poets. The meter is different, so form is different, content is different, genre is same, poetry. What I'm trying to say is that by 1730s, changes had started showing up. So you have Thomson's The Seasons making its appearance, where form remains quite the same, still the Miltonic blank verse, but the content undergoes a change. The content now is the seasons, a component of nature, the 4 English seasons. And we are looking at a gradual change being initiated in the content. The form is still what it was. Hence, these changes, they declare that a new thought pattern is on its way. Changes do not happen in literature overnight. So I take Thomson's Seasons as a very important marker out there. The next person I would like to mention here cursorily is Thomas Gray. Elegy written in a country churchyard, and several of us are familiar with the title, I think. Elegy written in a country churchyard You look at the year and you see it's 1751. You see it's an elegy. When you read the poem, you see that we have moved away to a different kind of subject matter for poetry. The shift is even more dominant, and yet you find that elegy written in a country churchyard is a tedious read. I use the word tedious because somewhere you find that the subject matter doesn't seem to be agreeing with the form, if I may say so. Genre is poetry, but there is somewhere a mismatch between the form, which has been closer to what is being followed in the 18th century, and the subject matter, which has gradually undergone a sort of a very distinct change of subject, of content. The next work I would like to draw your attention to is Relics of Ancient English Poetry, 1765, Bishop Thomas Percy, a collection of ballads, and this was something which would mark a return to the old forms of literature. By this time, if we are already wondering why are people turning so much towards the seasons, the churchyard, the ballads, the old forms, let me also remind you that by this time we are already into the midst of certain important social changes. For example, the impact of an ever expanding industrial revolution. Sometime when you perhaps have studied the rise of the novel in English literature, you would relate it to the rise of the middle classes and the expanse of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution sought land, and land, the further encroachment upon land, and we see a gradual concern towards nature gradually blooming. In 1765, with the relics, you have a return to the ancient forms of literature. You have a return to the ancient forms of ballads, a renewed interest in folk tales. So somewhere a closer to the soil connect is developed and propagated in relics of ancient English poetry. I take these three works as some of the markers which I feel are important to the understanding of how and why we have a shift towards Romanticism. Apart from these, there were certain political events which kind of, should I say, acted as catalysts. Firstly, there was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, between England and France, determining the superior. There was the American War of Independence. So when you talk about this, which we heard right at the beginning, a sort of rebellion against authority, questioning of authority. This is the social scenario in terms of what the nation is undergoing. First, the 7 Years' War, then the impact of the American War of Independence. We are all familiar with the Declaration of the American Independence, 1776. So the War of American Independence, 1775 to 1783. And the newly emerged America, which was still a part of the evolving novels and genres of English literature, suddenly claiming its independence of Great Britain. And this was followed by the French Revolution. So Britain, England, may I say, from all ends, is in a phase of political turmoil. There is a social change, there is an economic change, and there is political turmoil from several sides. Add to it the ideological influences. And the resultant factor, if I may say, I find this very interesting in the transition from the precursors to Romanticism to the beginnings of what we call Romantic Age proper, is visible in the works of William Blake like perhaps nobody else. A transition poet, his works map these social upheavals and changes, and they also record contemporary social concerns. For example, Blake's poems on the chimney sweeper, or if you are looking at Blake's songs of innocence and experience. You are actually looking at somebody showing you the entire society of the 18th century. So this is what preceded the lyrical ballads. And look at those dates and works by Blake. Poetical Sketches, 1783. Songs of Innocence, whoa, that's the year of the French Revolution, 1789. And then Songs of Innocence and of Experience, 1794. So here is poetry going hand in hand with the social upheavals of the time to almost demonstrate how the change is being enacted in the space of literature. Apart from all of this, we come to some important ideological influences of the time. So what are the important ideological influences I would like to share with you? I'm sure you're familiar with this already. Sturm und Drang, the German literary movement of the late 18th century, that which exalted, venerated nature, feelings, and the individual. And there was also the impact of German transcendental idealism. Now, what is German transcendental idealism? I'm quite sure that my colleagues will forgive me for simplifying this, but for the students out here, in a nutshell, if you're looking at that word transcendental, you are also keeping at the back of your minds the word rationalism, reason. Transcendental idealism attributed to Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, especially with his work, The Critique of Judgment, 1790, highlighted the idea of subjective self and individual subjectivity. That is, the idea that we do not perceive things the way they are, we perceive the things almost through a sieve of the subjective self. It is the subjective self which refines, which kind of, almost, it is the subjective self which makes us perceive things the way we do. So, things are not completely defined and tied up by the realms of reason and rationality. There is a tendency to go beyond, and this going beyond is what you might, for this moment at least, take to be transcendental ideology. So the transcendental idealism is extremely important as an influence on the English Romantic movement. In 1790, you have Critique of Judgment, and in 1798, publication of Lyrical Ballads. May I now put it in a straight line? So when we talk about the beginnings of Romanticism and we refer to the Lyrical Ballads in 1798, we need to remember that the change, the initiation of this change in the social and literary movement which would gradually come had already begun for quite some time. And this was not just a product of the English soil, it was a product of a cultural osmosis, a penetration of several cultures and several ideological, socio-political movements which blossomed in the form of the lyrical ballads. And what was the change initiated? Well, the lyrical ballads said that, or may I be more clear in saying that Wordsworth in the lyrical ballads stated that poetry would be written in the language of common men. There is a shift in the kind of language used in poetry. Also, the lyrical ballads specified that poetry would be written with two purposes, two aims. And what would these aims be? The purpose would be to, as you see, unfamiliarize the familiar and familiarize the unfamiliar. Unfamiliarize the familiar, there comes the answer to the question we had started off with. Why daffodils for Wordsworth? Why not daffodils for Pope? Well, daffodils for Wordsworth. Daffodils are familiar, but Wordsworth's subjectivity, Wordsworth's subjective perception, his blending of the beauty of daffodils into the language of the common man, distills it from an everyday experience of a common yellow bloom out there and makes it look exotic through the eyes, through the imagination of the poet. So, unfamiliarizing the familiar, something which Wordsworth would be doing. Again, if you look at his Tintern Abbey, familiar place, unfamiliar because of the poetic perception. So the poetic imagination, the romantic imagination of the poet would be perceiving and in a way filtering the way you and all of us, why should I say you alone, all of us use filters these days. So let us say this is a subjectivity which would filter the familiar and enhance the beauty of it. And familiarize the unfamiliar, well, that was the area of Coleridge, familiarizing the unfamiliar. He was writing about things which are unheard of. If you read the poetry of Coleridge, we often discuss the supernatural in the poetry of Coleridge, supernatural elements. What are these supernatural elements? The unfamiliar, those which are not defined, not known, and there is an attempt to define it, an attempt to define it as perceived by the creative imagination of the poet. We continue. Let us take a better look at things. So, unfamiliarizing the familiar, and hence we find these are familiar lines, I'm sure. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. This entire perception, you see, this is not daffodils, this is Wordsworth's perception of the daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud. That I out there is the romantic subjective I, individual. And so when we talk about romanticism and we talk about the main features of romanticism, we say return to nature, individual and subjectivity. This is beginnings of romantic poetry. To look at Coleridge and his familiarizing the unfamiliar through his poetry, I have taken an excerpt from the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Nor dim nor red like God's own head, the glorious sun uprist. Then all averred I had killed the bird that brought the fog and mist. 'Twas right, said they, such birds to slay that bring the fog and mist. So not dim nor red like God's own head. And who has experienced God's head? So you see, there is an intense attempt through poetic imagination to familiarize that which is distant, which is unknown. The description is that of sunrise, the rising sun, and yet the example which has been used, it sort of, familiarizes that which is unfamiliar. However, we note here that romanticism is not to be simply summed up as a generic term which would imply a similar perspective in all the works, in all the genres, across all this period that we spoke about. Not quite. Coleridge himself, though we talk about the lyrical ballads, and we talk about the beginning of romanticism with the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge. Coleridge himself would later revise his concept of poetry and poetic imagination. And he would also actually disagree with Wordsworth's opinions, especially related to language of poetry, which was perceived in lyrical ballads, when he goes on to publish his own Biographia Literaria in 1817. So you have the same individual traveling through a span of 2 decades, almost 20 years, to develop upon his thoughts of poetry. Thoughts are at no point of time static. trust me, whether or not we have been listening to only what I have been saying, we have all been thinking, and thoughts are never static. Thoughts don't stick to a place. We develop upon our own thoughts. And so Coleridge might have started off with Wordsworth in this venture of the lyrical ballads. But by 1817, we have Coleridge adopting a completely different perspective, and there is a shift, and he reasons it out with his definition of fancy, primary imagination, secondary imagination, when he reaches his Biographia Literaria in 1817. Hence, when we talk about romantic poetry, Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, and Coleridge, we call them the early romantics, while Shelley, John Keats, and Byron are referred to as the later romantics. Let us look at the difference in perspectives between the early romantics and the later romantics. I have tried out a fun exercise out here. I do not vouch for the fun part of it, but let's go through the exercise. These are two poems I have taken. One is To the Skylark by William Wordsworth, and one is To a Skylark by Shelley. And it would be sin here not to mention that this is not my original doing. This is the way we were taught to differentiate between the early romantics and the later romantics by my teacher when we were students. So let's take a look at this. To the Skylark, Wordsworth. Ethereal minstrel, pilgrim of the sky, dost thou despise the earth where cares abound? Or while the wings aspire, our heart and eye, both with thy nest upon the dewy ground, thy nest which thou canst drop into at will, those quivering wings composed that music still. So for Wordsworth, the skylark, his skylark, is a pilgrim of the sky. And when we use the word pilgrim, what we imply is a pilgrim is definitely a non-resident. A pilgrim is somebody who has a home where he will return or where she will return. But come to Shelley and you see a radical shift. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Hail to thee, blithe spirit. So it's not even a bird anymore. For Shelley, his skylark is a spirit. It is the spirit of revolution. Bird thou never wert. He denies the earthly existence of the bird completely. The bird is symbolic of the revolutionary spirit soaring higher up there. While for Wordsworth, the bird is a pilgrim. And the last line of his poem is, true to the kindred points of heaven and home. So Wordsworth's skylark, the skylark of the early romantic, is a balanced bird. By the time you reach Shelley, you have gone into realms of revolutionary spirit. It is more radical. There is a kind of, tearing away, breaking off from whatever exists. And so in Shelley, you find To a Skylark, skylark symbolizing the revolutionary spirit that moves away from the earth. There is no question of any nest. There is no question of returning because it is not a bird. It is not a flesh and blood bird. Now, this difference in perspective, it would be very interesting to note. For me, it has always been very fascinating, especially when we have engaged in, differences between the later romantics themselves. It is very interesting to note that this difference in perspectives is in place even when we are talking about, let's say, Shelley and Keats. Let's take a look. Let's take a look. An exercise once again. So we have Ode to the West Wind. I believe that was a part of your syllabus already. So Ode to the West Wind, Shelley, and To Autumn, Keats. Let's read through Ode to the West Wind. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. Identification. There is an identification and there is an urge to unite with this revolutionary spirit embodied by the West Wind. a sort of, wanting to break away from the context, wanting to break away from lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. It is almost like wanting to be taken away from the contextual ties. Look at To Autumn, Keats. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. In a distinct, sharp contrast, do you notice there is a very quiet acceptance here? There is no desire to be freed from whatever is going around on all the sides. There is a humble acceptance. Spring might have its song, but you have your music too. So autumn for Keats is not a season of decay. It's a season of fruitfulness. It is a season that will bring everything to an end only for a further renewal. And the poet submits to the power of autumn. It is an acceptance, not a breaking away. Of course, we can have zillions of comparisons by using several such poems, and the best way I think to uh, look at these difference in perspectives when we talk about romanticism and early romantics and later romantics, for me the fun exercise is always going through the poems, the works, because the works speak better than any other person. So if you're picking up two poems side by side, you see for yourself where the difference lies. I wanted to share this much for today's lecture with you. We now move on to prose. What exactly was the situation of prose in the Romantic era? So, influenced by the typical characteristics of the age, prose also showed a change. What sort of a change? Imbibing subjectivity, individual feelings, return to nature, etc. Prose was also nurtured in the hands of romantic writers such as William Hazlitt, Charles Lamb, Thomas de Quincey. Of course, you can add many more writers to the age, but I would be focusing on just these three. So the important works as far as romantic prose is concerned: William Hazlitt, The Spirit of the Age, 1825. It is a collection of character sketches full of loftiness and warm eloquence, which is representative of the age. Charles Lamb, Essays of Elia, 1823. Elia, the pseudonym he took for himself, replete with pathos and humor. Actually, he has been called the most loved figure in English literature by his biographer. His essays, they are a blend of imagination and reality through extremely evocative prose. So I am not sure if any of us have read much of Charles Lamb, or whether you had it as a part of your syllabus, because I think I missed that. But Dream Children is a lovely essay which you might as well read. You will enjoy it. A blend of imagination and reality. And the Dream Children, as the title suggests, but when I'm saying this, actually I'm also spoiling it for you, but I have to say this because I need to illustrate a point. So as the title suggests, Dream Children, the children you come across in that essay, they are dreams, they are imagined. And yet, when you look at the little details of the childish activities they engage in, the pranks, the likings, the not likings, the way children are with their very major, sharp, pronounced likes and dislikes, their childish pranks, their ways of standing, their ways of sitting, their ways of, oh, not liking it at all, the description, you see that yes, prose has changed. This is not just prose. In fact, I personally feel Charles Lamb, with his essays, he kind of, blurs the distinction between poetry and prose. There is such tremendous, such a strong strain of imagination out there. You almost visualize the scene through the eyes of the writer. You are taken on a journey. Lamb shows the surroundings to you. When in his essay, The Superannuated Man, he is talking about superannuation, and he's talking about what it feels to be on streets when everybody else is busy. And especially, oh yes, this I must add, the wood had entered his soul. There is a line in The Superannuated Man. The wood, the desk where the where he used to work, and the desk and his association with the desk. And after superannuation, he realizes the wood had entered his soul. I must say that I have been reiterating this line in my head ever since this period of lockdown and keeping away from our educational institution. The wood does enter the soul, and it takes a Charles Lamb to put it like that. So we continue. Thomas De Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, again a remarkable work, an autobiographical account provided by De Quincey. It is marked for its easeful, conversational, and confessional tone. So that would be about prose in the Romantic era. Very quickly, I would like to talk about novels. Novels as a genre had also evolved already. You place them back to Richardson and Pamela and that 18th century milieu. And when we started the lecture this afternoon, we started with a reference to the emerging middle classes and the rise of the novel in English literature. So novel as a genre, of course, when you have such a tremendous change in the ideological paradigms, no genre, no literary genre can stay insulated from the impact of this kind of a tremendous change in the thought process. So how did this impact the novels? What impact did the Romantic age have on the novels? The novel underwent a paradigm shift in thought and content through the Romantic era. So as the thought changed, so the content changed. What was there were a couple of developments in novel during this time, which cannot be very, I would not take a linearity to judge it, as I would come to it eventually. Let us talk about this first. One major development was the shift from the sentimental tradition of Richardson to the emergence of the Gothic novel. Now you remember, you would recollect the question of Percy's Relics, 1765. Returning to the folk tales, the ballads, everything that is old, and everything that is old, of course, if you are blending it with imagination and fantasy, it is extremely, it becomes extremely potential for giving rise to the Gothic, the element of Gothic. And hence, in mid 18th century, we look at an emerging trend of the Gothic novel. The Gothic novel, which is initiated by Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, 1764. Further nurtured in the hands of Anne Radcliffe, you could name several. I have taken up The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794. Incidentally, 1794, the calendar is very interesting at this late 18th century point of time. 1794 is also the time of your Songs of Innocence and Experience being published together. This Gothic novel is with what would take a new form and emerge in a new dimension altogether in the hands of Mary Shelley much later, Frankenstein, 1818. And when we are talking about Romantic age and Romantic literature, we hardly have a talk which is complete without a reference to Mary Shelley. Frankenstein, what is happening in that? If you have read the novel or seen the film, though of course I am not very happy with the filmed version done at different points of time. If you go to the novel, you see Mary Shelley, you interact with Mary Shelley, and that is a better way to know a work at any point of time. So in Frankenstein, you have Victor Frankenstein, the protagonist, creating life out of the remains of life. That is, with his tremendous knowledge in sciences, he decides that he is going to bestow life. How will he bestow life? He decides he's going to take away, remains from the corpses, put them together, form a frame, and bestow life upon it. And so what happens? He bestows life upon it, but does the form of life which is created out of remains of life, is it going to be beautiful at any point of time? It is an ugly, hideous thing. He cannot look at it himself. So it becomes the creature. So Victor Frankenstein decides to become God. He will bestow life. And what he creates is what he cannot look at. There is a subversion. There is a question of Gothic, which is interspersed with the idea of Prometheus, the one who challenged authority.
Please stay with us. We would shortly resume. Just a minor technical glitch.
Is this all right now? Should I resume?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Is this visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes.
Thank you once again. So yes, that much about Frankenstein. It's an eerie text. You mention it, and it makes its emergence. Important writers and works. This period also saw an emerging trend in the development of something called a social novel. I am calling it a social novel just for the purpose of convenience right now, because the social novel was not exactly romantic in nature, but it had a social setting, it had a social characteristic, and it was developed in the hands of primarily women writers such as Fanny Burney, Maria Edgeworth, and later Jane Austen. But there is a lot more in between the lines. So do not treat it as romantic per se, but what I'm trying to say is that these are the changes which the genre called novel saw with the Romantic age in English literature. But the most important novelist of this period is perhaps Sir Walter Scott. It is he who imparts to the novel a romantic sense of landscape and grandeur. So going back to the medieval times, Ivanhoe, picking up, you know, episodes, picking up stories, picking up lores, and, recreating the magic through a romantic perception is what you find in the works of Sir Walter Scott. So when you say romantic novels, you mention Sir Walter Scott for sure. Waverley, 1814, and Ivanhoe, 1819, being just two of his important works. When we talk about romanticism per se, romanticism in English literature, that which is our topic today, romanticism is a huge term. And it is very difficult to, draw margins to romanticism here and there. When I was given this opportunity to speak to you today on romanticism in English literature, I thought I would just try to define the premises on which we base our understanding of the term romantic. So, if it is about the individual perception, where does it come from? If it is about return to nature, why do we return to nature? And if it is about subjectivity, what else was happening in other places, in other areas? How much did the English imbibe? And how much of English literature was influenced by the socio-political currents of the time. So that is what we tried to trace together for today's lecture. It was an overview, and I think that should be it for today. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was indeed a very detailed deliberation on the topic and insightful too. Now, first off, we have a question by Dr. U. Chaturvedi, our principal. She says she just wants to know the present scenario of romantic poetry. And the second part of the question is, does geography affect literature? What is your opinion about it?
These are extremely interesting questions. Thank you so much, ma'am. Yes, of course, of course. Geography does affect literature in a big way. We are talking about the actually the geopolitical scheme of things when we talk about literature. Literature cannot be isolated from that. And talking about romanticism, could you please repeat the first part of the question? I was so enthralled by the second part. I missed the first part. Could you
Yes,
please repeat
ma'am.
the first part
What
of
is the present scenario of romanticism in literature?
present scenario of romanticism in literature, ma'am? I would personally say that I feel that romanticism, despite all the isms which have, come and gone into perspectives and the literary scenario so far, I think the spirit of romanticism has existed from the earliest works of literature and is there till today. This is one ism perhaps in literature which cannot be defined or kept confined to one particular spatio-temporal domain, one particular space or one particular nation or one particular culture. So there is, in fact, we have been exploring through the last 1 year, the college that I work for, we have been exploring, we have been working on a project called Rethinking Romanticism. And rethinking romanticism has been about looking at the counter gazes of romanticism, because romanticism has not been confined to that particular period. Let's say, even if I'm talking about 1780s to 1830s, we have to, in today's lecture, for example, because I was given to understand that it is for the students at the UG level, I have not included the component of Indology, the idea of looking at the other, the oriental gaze, and the Orient, which also had its own gaze towards the empire. So, romanticism in today's context, there is a lot more to read between the lines. There is a lot more to read into the context. So, there is a lot of work which has been done, and there is so much more which is still there to explore.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to know the recent, any recent writer, good poet, or any writer. That is what I wanted to know.
All right. Right now, we are, what as far as my reading of romanticism goes in the current scenario, there is a, a very scholarly attempt at trying to integrate interdisciplinary perspectives into romanticism. For the recent international conference that we had on rethinking romanticism at our college, we had Professor Tim Fulford visiting us, and he spoke to us about Coleridge and his association with the contemporary medical scenario. What he picked from there exactly, his knowledge through his friends who were into medicine, and how that is also reflected in his writings, which when we are reading literature, we are perhaps not aware of because we have not looked at it through the interdisciplinary lenses. So these are the areas which are now being explored by the scholars in romanticism.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next off, we have a question by Dr. Katayar.
Yeah.
Ma'am, may I please ask you to
Yes,
pose your
please.
question to ma'am? I'm asking Dr. Katayar. Please.
I'm sorry.
Okay. No, no, no.
Welcome, Dr. Gargi, on the portal of Awadh Girls Degree College. I'm Seema Singh Kachar in the Department of English here.
Hello, ma'am. Nice.
It was good. It was good to hear in your talk about the Gothic fiction, which my students do study as a part of their curriculum. Thank you so much for such a lovely talk. First of all, congratulations are due. It was a very exhaustive, at least for my students, the undergraduate ones, and for the postgraduate ones too, a very exhaustive discussion in all the three mainstreams, including fiction, prose, and poetry. Now, there was one thing that I wanted to point out, rather, you are an expert in this field, that Jane Austen, when she writes in the 1811, 12, then she basically belongs to the previous era, rather than to the conforming to the romantic principles. So when my students pick up a text which belongs to the romantic era and they find something which is highly unromantic, it shocks them.
Yeah.
And secondly, could you please, because, you know, at that young age, when you pick up a Jane Austen's novel, which supposedly talks about love, marriage, and then the kind of discussion that unfolds in the novel, that's kind of, you know, doesn't meet up to the expectations with which they approach the text. And secondly, if you could situate the importance of preface to lyrical ballads in consolidation of the romantic principles for the next century as well.
All right. I would try to answer.
Bring about, yes.
I would try to answer that, ma'am.
Just
First, with reference to Jane Austen, this is something, this is a question very close to my heart. I mean, I was almost wishing that somebody would ask this, because Jane Austen is just so not romantic. Once again, when we talk about romantic, what I was trying to put across in my slide also. But that is, let's say, when we talk to the students, I am also telling them about, mostly when we are dealing with Jane Austen, what I also tell them about, parallel to critique of judgment and somewhere between, you see,
yes.
Songs of Innocence and Experience, there is a vindication of the rights of women. So
yes, absolutely.
Mary Wollstonecraft and that very silent undercurrent, which was playing up. And then you have particularly Pride and Prejudice, something which our students study as part of their curriculum, being written as First Impressions.
Ours too studied, yes.
Okay. So First Impressions in 1796, and then being kept with the author for such a long time till it is revised as Pride and Prejudice and eventually published. So it is that trajectory I trace with them in order to show them that there is a very silent undercurrent which is very different. So if you have Rousseau talking about, you know, if we have Noble Savage and Rousseau, we also have Emile and Rousseau at the same time.
Yes, absolutely.
So that discourse is again a different thread which cannot be very you know, nicely brought into the romantic scope of things. That is why at a glance the anti-romantic perception which happens with the students, they're in a state of shock. What is this about?
Yes, absolutely.
And ma'am, about your question on the preface to lyrical ballads.
Yes, just a brief comment on its importance in the entire movement. That's it.
All right. Preface to lyrical ballads, its importance in the entire movement, in the movement that we would talk about as the Romantic Age or the Romantic Age in English literature, is primarily kind of initiating a shift in perspective of understanding what poetry is about. Immanuel Kant, well, that's philosophy, but philosophy is not to be approached by the common reader, or not thought of to be approached by the common reader. Now, through preface to lyrical ballads, what is done is a very beautiful initiation of change in thought and concept about what poetry is going to be like, what the language of poetry would be about, what the context of poetry would be about. And even now, when we read preface to lyrical ballads sitting today in the 21st century, it talks to us. because we still have that very conception of poetry somewhere, the powerful overflow, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That is what we think of in terms of poetry. So Wordsworth is close to our heart. Preface to Lyrical Ballads communicates as it initiates a change in the thought and concept of poetry. That is what I would think it is.
Right. Thank you. But instead of it came actually in the 1801 edition, which was the second edition of his poetry,
Yeah.
Lyrical Ballads. So could you please enlighten the students, why was there a need to bring a preface in the second edition and a larger one in the third edition, rather than having it in the first edition itself?
I would, though not, rather not step into the details, because right now I have been quite distant from the detailed preface understanding for some time now. But
Right.
as we have been dealing with Coleridge and more, exhaustively with Coleridge to that point, so Wordsworth begins as my point of deviation somewhere.
Right.
Right. So.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For the lovely discourse as well as for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we have a question by Anag. Anag, go ahead, ask your question.
Ma'am, I wanted to know that did the readings of Shakespeare change with the coming in of the Romantic age?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, this is again a very interesting question, Anak. Readings and interpretation of all kind of literature underwent a change, and Shakespeare was no exception. And how did the reading change? Well, when you have the perspectives shifting from the, let's say, towards the individual, towards subjectivity, you had reading of Shakespeare also shifting, readings and interpretations of literature also shifting to a character-based study, a character-based study where the individual becomes important. So Shakespeare is now not just about a master craftsman or a master playwright, but an individual who has explored life. So Hazlitt has this beautiful essay on Puck, particularly, Midsummer Night's Dream. There is an exploration of the characters. Coleridge has exhaustive essays on Shakespeare. He's talking about the characters. And these characters, again, as I said, we do not draw margins to Romanticism anywhere in terms of the timeline. Even A.C. Bradley, as late as 1904, we are talking about character-based criticism, very individual-based, character-based study of Shakespeare and interpretation of Shakespeare. So that is what the Romantic movement did to interpretations of Shakespeare.
Thank you, ma'am. Next we have Nikita. Go ahead, ask your question, Nikita.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good
Ma'am, my
afternoon.
question is nature a dominant, plays a part of dominant in romantic poetry?
I'm sorry, Nikita, could you please repeat once again?
Ma'am, is nature a dominant theme in romantic poetry?
Nature, yes, but nature, not just as nature is outside, as in not just a description, but as a subjective experience. That is, nature as experienced by the poet. So the nature as sensed by the poet. Let's say on mornings, normally when you greet your friends, it's a good day for some, it's a bad for some. I'm not using a very good aesthetic example, but I'm just trying to talk about subjectivity. This good and bad changes according to your experience of the day, which may not be rooted in any concrete reason. But it is about the subjective perception on a much different level when it comes to aesthetics and art. The subjective self of the poet experiences nature. And it is that nature which we are looking at when we pick up romantic poetry per se.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Next,
you.
and this is probably the last question, is by Akriti. Akriti, go ahead. Akriti, please unmute yourself. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
My name is Akriti Marwa, and I'm in BA third year.
Yes,
Ma'am,
hi.
my question is, Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, did Romanticism as a literary change also have an impact on readings and interpretation of literature?
Yes, thank you for that question once again, Akriti. This is something in line with what I think Anag asked a while ago, but that was more Shakespeare specific. Yes, Romanticism initiated a change in reading and interpreting literature and literary works. And this was sometimes of an extent that went completely against the writer's intention. Let me cite an example here. If you have, I don't know whether Milton's Paradise Lost is a part of your syllabus at any particular point of time, but if you read Milton's Paradise Lost, you also come across Blake's criticism, and where Blake calls Milton as belonging to the devil's party without knowing it. And when you read Paradise Lost, there is a tendency that we kind of find it, especially in the romantic interpretations and the post-romantic interpretations, more leaning towards Satan because he questions authority. He questions the authority of God, which he calls the tyranny of God. So we somewhere have a sympathetic strain going towards Satan as one who questions traditional orthodox hierarchy. And this scheme of interpretation was a result of, if you remember, when we were going through the presentation, I very briefly tried to present to you the kind of political upheavals England was experiencing at that point of time. So when you have these upheavals in mind and you have the, the kind of a vision of the rebel who is questioning traditional authority as the one who becomes the protagonist, what happens is that in Blake's reading of Paradise Lost, he reads it against the intention of Milton. Milton was trying to justify the ways of God to men. With Blake's reading, it is Milton belongs to the Satan's party, the true devil's party, without knowing it. So there is a highlighting of Satan as the hero instead of, let's say, what Milton had intended it to be. So romantic interpretations, romantic movement has its tremendous impact on the ways literature is read and interpreted from that particular period onwards. So much so that we talk about romantic criticism. When we come to interpretations and studies, we talk about romantic criticism. Romantic criticism referring to those which talk about individual-based, character-based criticism and talk about the upturning of the traditional orthodox hierarchy. There is a sort of rebellion, and the sympathy of the reader is directed with the rebel. Directed towards the rebel, is with the rebel entirely. So authority is symbolic of tyranny. And this is just an example of the pattern of reading and interpretation, which became a emerging trend, an emerging trend with Romantic Age.
Thank you, ma'am. I now hand over the reins of the program to Rupal to formally propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. William Blake once said, and I quote, "Knowledge is life with wings." It is my proud privilege to propose a formal vote of thanks. Ma'am, after your thought-provoking and engaging lecture, there are so many things to be packed in 2 words. Thank you. Thank you for sparing your precious time.
Thank you.
The longer the island of knowledge, the longer the shoreline of wonder. Thank you, ma'am, for broadening our horizon of knowledge and understanding scope. We look forward for another informative session. Thank you, ma'am. We are indebted to Ms. Vikaji, President, Managing Committee, for making it possible for us to conduct the event. We are grateful to Professor Pandey, Manager Secretary, Managing Committee, for her constant support in making the event possible. We are thankful to Dr. Chaturvedi, Principal, Awadh Girls Degree College, for her help and guidance in all our events. I would like to thank Dr. Katayar for always being our solid support system. Ma'am, your role in conducting any event cannot be summed up in words. I could go on and on. My heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Krishna for steering us in the right direction with her valuable insights and organizing the event. This webinar would not have been possible without the technical assistance of Ma'am Sharma. Ma'am, it was an absolute honor for us to have you as the host of the event. I would like to thank all the faculty members from our and also from other various colleges for taking our time and staying with us throughout the session. Without a disciplined and extremely engaged audience, no event cannot be successful. Thank you to all the participants for making the event successful. Now, I would like to request everyone to please switch on their cameras so that we can have a group picture. Thank you.